Today, we're diving into a real classic of Christian theology. It's called Holiness, and it's by Bishop J.C. Ryle. We're going to explore his incredibly powerful arguments on sin, spiritual growth, and what it really truly means to live out a life of faith.
Now, you have to remember, Ryle wrote this way back in the 19th century. And even then, he saw what he believed was a huge problem, something that was weakening the church from the inside out. He saw this growing gap between what people said they believed and how they actually lived their lives.
And you've got to understand, he wasn't just some academic theologian sitting in an ivory tower. No, he was a pastor. And he was deeply concerned that Christian belief was becoming totally disconnected from the nitty-gritty of daily life. That's why he wrote with a kind of clarity and passion that, honestly, still hits hard today.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the crisis of holiness that he saw. Then, we'll get into the mistaken solutions he warned everyone against. Third, we'll take a deep dive into his understanding of sin. And finally, we'll see his vision for what true sanctification is all about.
So, right out of the gate, Ryle identifies this crisis. And what's interesting is that it wasn't a crisis of doctrine. It's not that people didn't know the right things to say. No, it was a crisis of holiness. A really deep disconnect between what people professed with their mouths and what they practiced with their lives. I mean, he pulls no punches here. He points out, very directly, that the outside world often looked at Christians and saw absolutely no difference in how they acted day to day. In fact, he said sometimes they were right to complain that non-religious people were actually kinder or more unselfish. Ouch.
So for Ryle, the bottom line is this: belief has to be matched by character. Period. He argued that without a holy life to back it up, even the most perfect doctrine becomes this empty, useless thing that actually hurts the reputation of Christianity itself.
So, after identifying the problem, Ryle then moves on to dismantle some popular but, in his view, really dangerous shortcuts to holiness that were floating around. We're going to look at 3 of his biggest warnings. First, he tackles this idea that holiness is achieved by faith only, in the same kind of passive way that a person is justified. He says, no, that's not how it works. While faith is the root of everything, the kind of faith that leads to holiness is always active. It demands personal effort, it demands discipline, and it demands work. He also pushed back hard against relying on inward feelings. He saw people chasing these emotional highs, these dramatic spiritual experiences. But he argued that real holiness isn't about tears or excitement. It's about the character of Christ being visible in our ordinary daily lives, how we are at work and how we are at home. Now, this next one is a big one. He took direct aim at perfectionism, this idea that a Christian can actually reach a state of being completely free from sin in this life. Ryle said this is totally unbiblical. In fact, he argued that the most spiritually mature believers are actually the most aware of their own flaws and the constant internal battle against sin. And that critique leads us right to the absolute foundation of his entire argument. Ryle was convinced you cannot even begin to talk about holiness until you first dig deep into the really uncomfortable but absolutely essential subject of sin. So when Ryle talks about sin, he's not just talking about a list of bad things you did. To him, it's way deeper than that. He sees it as this profound moral disease that we inherit, a fundamental corruption of our very nature. It's any deviation, even in our thoughts, from God's perfect standard. And to really get a handle on this spiritual disease, he breaks it down for us, almost like a doctor giving a diagnosis, by looking at 4 critical aspects: its origin, its extent, its guilt, and its deceitfulness. So, first things first, where does it even come from? Ryle is emphatic on this point. Sin isn't something we primarily learn from a bad environment or hanging out with the wrong crowd. He says it's an internal condition, a family disease passed down from Adam, and it's present in every single human heart right from birth. And to show just how far-reaching it is, Ryle uses this brilliant, kind of devastating image. He says humanity is like a majestic temple that was designed to be a dwelling place for God himself. But now it's in complete and utter ruins. He argues that sin has corrupted every single part of us: our reason, our will, our affections, the whole thing. Okay, but how serious is it really? For Ryle, there's one ultimate measure of sin's guilt: the cross.
The fact that nothing less than the death of God's own Son could atone for it proves, in his view, just how terribly, horribly dreadful it must be. And finally, and maybe this is the scariest part, he warns us about how deceitful it is. Sin almost never shows up looking like a deadly enemy. Instead, it disguises itself as something harmless. It comes to us with a friendly kiss or a flattering word, just to lure us in. All right, so after laying out that pretty grim, but for him, very realistic foundation, Ryle finally pivots. He then builds his case for what true holiness, what he calls sanctification, actually is. He defines sanctification as this positive, ongoing work of spiritual transformation. So it's not just about being forgiven for sin, it's about Christ, through the Holy Spirit, actively working inside a believer to separate them from their love of sin and make them genuinely, practically godly in their day-to-day life. And this next point is absolutely crucial because it's something people get mixed up all the time. He makes a sharp distinction between justification and sanctification. Justification, he says, is a one-time legal act. It's God declaring us righteous because of what Christ did for us. But sanctification, that's the lifelong, gradual process of the Spirit working in us to actually make us righteous. See the difference? So what does this actually look like in real life? Ryle says this process always leaves visible marks. Not some mystical feelings or empty religious talk, but a habitual, practical effort to live by God's law and follow Christ's example, which shows up as a life of active love and just doing your duty right where you are. And this is really the whole point for Ryle. True holiness isn't about escaping the world, hiding out in a monastery to be spiritual. It's about engaging with the world as a transformed person and glorifying God in the most ordinary parts of your life, in your family, on your street, and in your business. And all of this leaves us with a pretty challenging thought. Ryle's arguments from the 19th century force us to confront a question that is just as relevant today as it was back then. It challenges every single one of us to ask, what is the true relationship between my deepest convictions and my daily actions?